This week on the show, we recap our experience at the Dev Summit in BSD Cambridge from last week, share why memcmp is more complicated than expected, and we also explore Docker on FreeBSD. And last but not least, we look at a retro terminal. So if this is interesting to you, then stick with us for this weekly episode of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 207, Bridge over the River Cam, recorded for the 16th of August 2017. Hi, I'm your host, Benedikt Reuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And we have a great episode for you, starting with our recap of BSD Cam, which is the BSD Cambridge Developer Summit in the first week of August. And Alan will walk us, Alan and I will walk you through what we did there.
Yep. So the 2017 Cambridge Dev Summit took place August 2nd through 4th. The event took place over those 3 days and included a formal dinner at St. John's College and was attended by 55 registered developers and their guests. But prior to the start of the conference, we actually had a doc hacking day. The computer lab generously provided us with a room where we could meet and try to spend some time working on documentation specifically. I think the most interesting thing that came out of that, though, was Silvanjanian walked two interested people through the process of creating documentation patches and submitting them, and it was their first times.
Excellent.
In the process, it actually found some ways to improve the documentation on how to write documentation. So he created a documentation patch for the documentation on how to write documentation patches.
It's kind of a meta thing, yeah.
Yeah. It was even more humorous to sleep-deprived me who had just got off an airplane.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine that's not being easy.
So the event is run in an unconference style, in that we brainstorm the actual session schedule and the topics on the first morning, with a focus on interactive topics that will best reflect the interests of those who are there, but also exploit the knowledge of the attendees. The idea is to maximize the amount of discussion and decisions that can be made while we're all in the same room, right? With access to whiteboards and so on, and how can we best utilize that? So that was interesting. So the first morning, what we do is we all gathered in the slightly too small and even more slightly under air-conditioned FW11, and we go around the room and introduce ourselves and list a few of the topics we're interested in discussing. These generate a giant list of topics on the whiteboard with a varying number of ticks beside them to indicate the number of interested people. And then we try to select the topics and the people in the rooms that make sense to assign those to and build a schedule.
Oh, yeah. That wasn't easy.
Mm-hmm. We had more breakout rooms of different sizes than in previous years, so that helped a bit. Even some of the smaller topics get a small breakout room and still happen instead of just having only two main topics. Of course, the most difficult part is always scheduling the sessions. There's overlap and certain topics is like, well, it'd be super helpful to have these three people in the room for this topic, and those three people also need to be in the room for this other topic and this third topic, and there's only so many slots in each of the days. But we managed to come up with a schedule, although I think it was revised once or twice throughout the conference ahead of time. But
yeah,
with a bunch of 1 hour and 45-minute topic blocks with half-hour breaks in between, we managed to have quite a conference.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of new people were there also this year, so they got into the whole BSD Cam groove and got to meet a couple of new people, and were also participating in the sessions, of course, and had a chance to talk to people in the hallway track between the sessions. That was, I guess, a good introduction for the whole group that we are participating in.
Yes, my Google Summer of Code student was at the conference as well, and got to introduce him to some people. And in particular, he had some questions about specific topics as he's working on his the boot environment project. So I got him to talk to a number of people that were experts in those areas. I think the first 3 areas he was interested in, it turned out all 3 people I had him talk to were former Google Summer of Code students.
Yeah, that happens. We've been there a couple of years, so yeah, it's a good thing to see those people continue into the project once Google Summer of Code is over and don't just disappear again.
And that, I think it probably helped my Google Summer of Code student a bit to realize that, well, that guy and that guy and all these people that did Summer of Code before are now, really big responsible people on the project that have done a lot of the work and are considered the expert. And it's like, I can see a future for myself here.
There's a career path, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the topics we ended up having working groups on were the tool chain, where they discussed compilers and linkers and external tool chain, which is using compilers and linkers and so on that are not part of FreeBSD. So that's being able to use, say, the latest version of GCC from packages or ports, especially can be important on some of the architectures that didn't exist back when the last GPL v2 version of GCC existed, and so need a newer GCC and maybe aren't supported by Clang yet. And they also talked about static analyzers and sanitizers, and starting to use those more to find problems in programs and get them fixed. The concurrent session, the one that I was in, was virtualization. They talked about Beehive with a number of different subtopics in there, including guest support. Some people were having trouble running a Lumos in Beehive, so they're trying to figure that one out. The question of, would it be possible to run Mac OS X in Beehive if it was FreeBSD running on Mac hardware? So you had the right license for it. Talk about nested virtualization, being able to run a Beehive in a Beehive. It looks like it's going to be a lot of effort, and it's not clear how useful it'll actually be, so maybe not high priority. There was some talk about 9pfs and what some of the problems were there, and looking at alternative VirtIO specs to try to provide that type of an interface, looking at process level virtualization and so on, talking about the suspend, resume, snapshot, and eventually live migration for Beehive. Questions about being able to live attach devices, even just add an extra disk or add and remove a CD from a running Beehive. And of course, the always popular topic, GPU pass-through for Beehive, so that you could pass through a video card into a Windows VM or something. There was also some talk about SGX, which is Intel's new processor extension to allow you to isolate VMs so that 2 VMs cannot possibly see each other. It basically segregates them off inside the CPU. And some questions about running Beehive virtualization for ARM 32 and 64-bit, and also possibly virtual IO MMUs to keep OSs from doing things they shouldn't, and so on. They talked a bit about Zen, but one of the most interesting parts was there were 2 developers from Docker who had mostly been working on the OS X port of Docker, but one of them was an OpenBSD advocate and kind of explained to us in the new world of Docker, which is very different from the original world of Docker, they've abstracted away a lot of all the Linuxisms and broken it down into a number of different smaller daemons that provide the various bits that it required to do Docker, and how we could provide those bits in a FreeBSD specific way without having to worry about Linuxisms and so on, such that eventually you could do a Docker run Nginx and it will create a regular FreeBSD jail, install the Nginx packages in it from the regular FreeBSD packages, set up the port forwarding or whatever rules in your firewall, and just make it all work, all in native FreeBSD. It's very interesting, and I hope that we can get a group of people together to do this and push that idea forward. Not just because Docker's kind of a popular thing and that it would be good for FreeBSD to have good support for it, but using it as a consumer to drive some other development I'd like to see, including libifconfig, so that with a library interface, you can create the additional interfaces, configure them, and so on, and configure the networking for the whole machine and the jail, and even extending the jail framework to make it easier to do building and deploying of jails. And Docker is just one of the consumers of this API to help us make sure the API has all the flexibility it needs.
Yeah, a lot of people are asking for this, and we're on it, but it needs people to write the code in the first place and coordinate with the others to put all the pieces together.
Yeah, currently one of our biggest needs, which was partially helped in this working group by having people from Docker, was there are not that many FreeBSD people that actually understand how Docker works or how to use it, because it's not really been available on FreeBSD, so we've not been using it. So if you're one of those Linux converts that has come over to BSD and actually understands kind of how the workflow and use cases of Docker, we could really use your help making it work really nicely on FreeBSD.
Yeah.
Even if it's, amazing. You're not a programmer or whatever, don't want to deal with the code, but just somebody who has experience with it to help us understand it would be very useful.
Yeah, no, that was this session, and the next session block. I didn't go to any of those next two sessions, but
so what did you work on?
I worked on some reviews. It was funny. The person I was doing the review with was sitting on the other side of the room, and I could basically just walk over and talk to him. But it was much easier doing it on IRC and on the review system that we have. Totally Dev Summit style. So I didn't participate in the sessions, but I managed to close a couple of problem reports, either outdated or finished by a commit, and do some review comments from some of my mentees or other reviews that I saw. So it was productive, definitely.
Yep. The transport session, which is mostly about TCP and so on and network performance, they started with a mini talklet from Jonathan Looney about the transport working group. So to keep the transport work ongoing, they have a bi-weekly teleconference call where they get all the people working on transport stuff together and talk about their progress and what's blocking them, and kind of coordinate getting all this work done, especially across vendors. There's people working on this at Dell Isilon and at Netflix and at Limelight and so on. And, making sure that all the work's getting done and that we aren't duplicating effort where we don't need to. And so he presented the progress that is made over the last year. So that was good to see. The slides are there in the wiki. Mm-hmm. And then they also talked about network performance, which was originally going to be a different session, but they had time, so they squished it in there. So they've also been talking about timers and other stuff, including Tom Jones was talking about some of the interesting API and transport stuff he's been doing at a university in Scotland. Mm-hmm. And they talked about a bunch of different stuff there. And then concurrent to that, we had the security and mitigation working group. So the talk here was looking at a lot of the different mitigations like WXRX, no exec stack, CFI or control flow integrity, ASLR and KASLR, safe stack, PAN, PXN, et cetera, looking at, for each of those, how practical it is and how desired it is to have each one of them, and then looking at how to manage the transition from not having them to having them as far as keeping applications working. So, we can... It's a much more constrained work set to make all this stuff work with the base system, especially since it's easy for us to control the source code for most of the stuff in the base system. However, to make these work with ports gets more interesting. So looking at an annotation framework and maybe a transition path where we go from opting into these technologies, when we know an application works fine with, no exec stack and WXRX or whatever, we can mark it as such. And then those features only enabled on applications that support it. And then eventually, once we hit the threshold, we can swap it around so that it's on for every application except for one specifically annotated to say it doesn't work. The way they dealt with this in OpenBSD was to have a per file system flag that just said, this one supports WX or not. But a more generic interface for it.
Yeah, that would be helpful to tie into that.
Yep.
And
there was
desktop
a
session?
bunch of other discussion there. The next topic was testing.
Testing, yeah, that's first. Yeah.
Yep. So for testing, they talked about the current status of testing on FreeBSD, and then they started looking at other stuff like what we want to test and what's the biggest requirement there, how to test those things, and eventually having a real QA process that we decide whether this is good to release or not. As always, the testing group is understaffed, and especially if you have any experience with testing or things like BuildBot and Jenkins, we'd love to have your help there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if people know testing or could write small tests, that would be helpful. Michael Lucas also did a call for help in some of his blog posts. We'll cover this in the show later on. And this is one of the results from this session, finding people who could write tests and help a little bit with the testing framework, because there's a lot of examples for how to write tests, and there's also a couple of wiki pages, and those are good starting points for people to get introduced into the project and do a little bit of help testing our big operating system or what other functionality it provides. Okay, next up was the desktop session. So the desktop session was started a bit earlier by Gavin Atkinson, who was leading that session, asking on Twitter what people are looking for in FreeBSD as a desktop. Not only desktop, but also Wi-Fi, graphics, and user-friendliness in general. And he got a couple of replies that were also included into the session. So that was a nice way of putting other people who weren't at the summit as part of the discussion into the room. So we talked about the state of graphics on your Intel chipsets, suspend and resume, which is an ongoing topic, of course, depending on the hardware and the manufacturer of the device that you have, especially the notebook or laptop that you get. Wi-Fi drivers and configurations was one point where we could improve, and also user-friendliness in general. The installer was mentioned, so people had a lot of issues with the installer, and we try to improve those, but apparently it seems like we would be needing another rewrite of the installer, which is a huge task all the time. But there were some ideas going around, and people were trying out some new things there. And we collected a couple of ideas what people are looking for in the new installer. That was something that came out of this session.
Yep. The Capsicum working group, we talked a bit about how to get more applications to use Capsicum, and that led to the idea of automating the conversion of applications. So we looked at using tools as part of the LLVM suite. They have one called SOAAP, which I forget what the acronym stands for now, but it's like the application sandboxing or something. And there was some talk about that. Then there was also using static analysis tools to find where you would insert the sandboxing or finding violations of the sandbox and so on. And looking for places where an application is not going to do the right thing. Apparently, there might be some problems in OpenSSL that if you're using it from inside Capsicum Sandbox, you can't open. There's certain calls will open dev crypto, and you won't be able to do it, and it would need to be done before you enter the sandbox and so on. A bunch of things like that. Then there was talk about Casper, which is the system. Certain services that you can't normally do inside the sandbox, like name resolution, because you can't make a TCP connection, and a bunch of other things, and talking about what the current services it provides are, and dealing with the fact that it lacks a lot of documentation currently, so it's hard to actually use, and that some of the services themselves are not actually sandboxed, and so you have to deal with that. Although in general, it's slightly complicated by the fact that most of these services exist because they're things you can't do in the sandbox. So how do you sandbox them?
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah.
So the current services that exist there's a DNS one that does your libc type DNS functions. One's for looking up user IDs in groups. One to get access to random data. One for password database operations, and one for getting certain sysctls and so on. Interestingly, they've been looking at some namespace management stuff, including, say, connect, and being able to subset that so that you can connect only to certain places and so on, or basically to allow you to, say, reconnect a socket, basically by being able to create a new socket as long as it only connects to the place you were already connected to, and so on. And then this led to the idea of extending that to the point where in Capsicum we just use a new API instead of connect and all the socket stuff, and just say, here's a URI, and I want you to connect and figure out what port it is and do all the work for me. And that led to this idea of services. So if you look, for example, at an application like Slack, which is this really terrible IRC replacement, the desktop app has really high CPU usage and memory usage because it brings along an entire copy of Chromium and so on in its Electron framework. Whereas the mobile version of the app that runs on like Android and iOS relies on the operating system on the device providing services that allow the application to be much lighter weight. Right? It doesn't have to bring its own notification system one. It's provided, and a bunch of other things. And so this led to the idea that maybe Capsicum could provide those type of services, or Casper as part of Capsicum. So one of the interesting ones that led to much more discussion was the idea of a configuration service. So instead of every application containing all the code to go and find its configuration and parse it and deal with reloading it and extending it and includes and all this other stuff, we abstract that into one common service, and then the application just says, hey, Casper, I would like my configuration, please. And Casper would return that in a consistent format. And so the idea was we'd have a UCL parser, maybe as part of the Capsicum service, and we just provide the in-memory representation of that configuration into the application. And maybe there's a KQ where it can be notified when that configuration has been updated and they refetch it or whatever. And then there was talking about doing the same thing for logging and notifications, so that maybe in a future version of FreeBSD, if you're on a desktop, instead of stuff going to syslog, you would like certain messages to actually pop up as notifications and so on. And then, extending the idea of that URI thing to having Capsicum actually provide the TLS for you, right? You just say, I want to make a connection to this and I want it encrypted with TLS, and you don't have to deal with all the SSL stuff. Casper just provides you with a file descriptor that you read and write to, and it's encrypted data.
Oh, that would be fascinating to see or to have.
And then there was some talk about CapSH, which is basically, it's not actually a shell yet, but the idea of being able to run a program in a Capsicum sandbox without modifying its source code. So currently they have the echo command working in this way, but cat doesn't quite work yet. So it's still early days for this, but the idea is being able to sandbox an application without modifying its source code, which is quite interesting.
Great.
And that was presented, part of that work was presented at BSDCan, and more of it will be presented at VBSDCon. So if you're coming to that, make sure you check out that session called Oblivious Sandboxing.
Wow, yeah. That's definitely a session worth watching.
Yep, and then there was some talk about the ongoing maintenance of Capsicum, in particular making sure that new syscalls get properly classified as being able to work inside the sandbox or not, and so on. Currently, we fail safe, but a lot of times things don't get labeled quite right yet. So yeah, there was lots about that. And then there was a tracing working group. They talked about Blackbox, dtrace, ktrace, KTR, ptrace, truss, and hardware tracing, and a bunch of other interesting bits. There was also a packaging and package-based session. They talk about the ability to create package sets so that you can, issue one command and get a bunch of packages and so on. A bit about talking about packaging the kernel and dealing with that, even though... Or actually, yes, I was in that session, and that's how I got assigned a bunch of work from that session.
That happens, yeah.
I was trying. It was like, how did I get assigned work if I wasn't there? That would be extra evil. But no, I was there.
From the others.
Also, some talk about ports and the concept of flavors and subpackages, and dealing with private libraries and so on. Some interesting stuff there. Then the concurrent working group was architectural security features. So this is different than the mitigation stuff we talked about previously, which is all software-based. The architectural security features one is features being built into processors now. So they talked about Intel SGX, ARM's PXN and PAN, pointer authentication, which I think is something that's happening in MIPS now. AMD is talking about a memory encryption standard. There's a presentation about some work with libcrunch, and then also looking at the new features they'll be adding to RISC-V, and some talk about Cherry, which is a project that happens at the University of Cambridge, where the conference was, to deal with, capabilities right in the OS as part of the pointers and so on.
Yeah, all good stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of ideas being generated, and ideas exchanged, and also solutions discussed. It's well worth visiting these dev summits just by looking at the notes.
Yep. The architectures and embedded systems working group basically talked about issues with all of these different architectures, including RISC-V, ARM v4, 5, 6, 7. ARM64, there's also ARM v8 and ARM v8 8.1 and 8.2 and so on. MIPS and MIPS64, SPARC64, etc. Talking about some of the problems with those architectures that aren't supported by our newer toolchain yet, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And in parallel to that was the teaching session led by myself. And so this was basically a session that we had at other conferences as well. So this is the general idea of teaching BSD to other people, or to share the knowledge what FreeBSD, or not only FreeBSD but BSD in general, what it is, what it can do, what people can get into it, and also programs like, do we more workshops at conferences, or should we do a little bit more teaching at the university and college level? And these were the session for the people that are involved in teaching, in what kind of way, and then finding common interests or common material to create, or different ways of teaching, like the University of Cambridge has been doing their L41, which is basically the teachbsd.org material for a number of years now, and they're doing another one in this year, and they are trying to work on what they learned from the previous runs and keep improving that. So they're using Jupyter Notebooks, for example, to make it easier for the students to write the lab reports and try out the tracing that they're doing in the BeagleBone Black. So this is an improvement, and we're going to see more from that once they have done that course already. And so this is going to be improved each time, and from the feedback that they get. We also talked a little bit. Yeah.
One of the interesting things there is L41 isn't really teaching FreeBSD. It's teaching operating system design and using FreeBSD as the base and the test case, basically. So you're using tracing to look at how FreeBSD does it while you're learning about, how the scheduler works, how a state machine works, how the TCP/IP stack works. And it's not that you're actually being taught specifically anything about FreeBSD. It's just that you're using FreeBSD as an example of a real-world operating system and being able to look at how it works to understand the design principles behind it. And then at the same time, we also looked at course material from Lee Wen's University in Taiwan, and some older versions of the stuff I used to teach, where we is actually teaching system administration on FreeBSD specifically, and kind of the differences between those two things. And we talked about the difficulties of trying to record teaching material.
Oh yeah.
We looked at the recordings that were made at Benedict's University when George was there teaching that course, and some of the problems with that. And then it's like, yes, they've I think tried twice now to record Robert Watson's, but they've never yet got a consistent set of them. There's always, the audio's bad in that one, and the lighting's bad in that one. And, over the years, I think they've got every one of the lectures captured, but not consistently.
Mm. And also the interaction is lost with the audience and the students. But it's something that people might want to try out or see whether they can learn from these videos, and then try to improve there. We also talked a little about target groups, like who are the people that we actually want to create these materials for in those videos, and how can people move from a general, I'm just interested in this kind of topic, into becoming a developer or a contributor to the projects. Which is one of the outcomes of the teaching. It shouldn't be the only one, but it's certainly one of the goals that we try to have with this teaching session. Also, getting the word out to people what FreeBSD is or what the BSD do, and it's all kinds of ways of bringing the knowledge that we have as developers or as contributors to other people, so that they can contribute themselves.
Yep. Then they had a provisioning and management tools group. They looked at some of the various things like SaltStack and how that works, and getting it switched over to using sysrc, and trying to standardize documentation and techniques and make it all apply to FreeBSD. And they also talked a bit about Puppet, Ansible, and Chef. Then they were looking at building images using different tools like Poudre and its support for VM and OS image builds, or tools like Packer, building images for Vagrant, EC2, Azure, VMware, etc. In particular, Packer's in need of a serial library that they're looking at here. There's an open issue. And then also there's a bento package for the Chef project for FreeBSD. There's also talk about orchestration for VMs and Beehive using Vagrant and OpenStack. Or pre-configured VMs for testing. It's actually based on the Jenkins infrastructure we have. We actually have snapshots of heads as VMs that already have all the testing stuff ready to go, and they're provided there. And then looking at packages and ports and packages support, and looking at different monitoring things like OS Query, Prometheus, Snap, telemetry, etc. A wish list of things like having, libifconfig integrated using jail configurations, structured log data, switching to a newer version of syslogs RFC, improve diskless approaches so that you can run machines with no disks and not necessarily rely on NFS or something, things like that. Looking at cross-install approaches and, how to configure the installer from macOS or Linux and then install FreeBSD. Or creating SD card images on other OSs and that type of stuff. Trying to get FreeBSD technology deployed in more places in the base system of FreeBSD itself, like libzo and libucl, and trying to map out the path as we switch to UCL. We definitely want to keep human readable formats, and we want to have forward and backward compatibility. When the config format does change, like say we introduce a new UCL config, we need to introduce a new config, then eventually switch it to be the default, and then only after a long transition actually remove support for the old format. Because you don't want people to do an upgrade and then everything stops working.
Yeah, that would be bad, since people are upgrading from FreeBSD versions like forever, and people expect a certain functionality in that regard. And next, there was the storage session by Alan Jude. Oh, that was glorious. Well, Alan started basically by introducing the latest features of ZFS, and people who watched the show had a couple of overlap there, but not many of the people in the audience had, apparently. So you could talk at length about the newest features in ZFS. That was really nice.
Yeah, so the day before my session, I just wrote up some quick notes, and I put together a couple bulleted lists. And this session ended up being a lot less interactive than I had hoped. At the end, we got to talking about a bit of stuff that is actually newer and ideas for things to do. But a lot of this session was me just brain dumping the status report
literally
of how storage on FreeBSD is going. So it provided a list of current new features in ZFS, upcoming features in ZFS, and so on. There was some talk about the native encryption in ZFS and what we'd need to do to support that, addressing missing bits of FreeBSD for that. My biggest topic I wanted to talk about was zero copy ZFS and support for send file in ZFS. So currently, FreeBSD has a system call that's had for a very long time called send file, where you give it an open file descriptor, an open socket, and a range of bytes, and it copies that all for you without going through userland. The idea is that it faults those that range of bytes into the page cache or the buffer cache in the OS, and then shares that buffer to the mbuff and all the way out the network stack, so that you don't end up copying that around in memory a bunch of times. For ZFS, that doesn't work that well currently, because the data is in the ARC, and then it gets copied from there into the buffer cache, which, the whole point of this is to avoid copying, so that's a copy you don't want to do, and then all that happens. And so it turns out in Solaris they came up with a solution to this, where they actually made it so you can borrow data from the ARC. It just requires you provide some storage in memory for ZFS to keep track of which ARC buffers is loaned you out, so that when you return them, it can do the cleanup and the housekeeping to return those to the operating system. And so I'm started work on ways to implement this in FreeBSD so that we could have the the performance improvements you get from send file on ZFS. So we discussed that for a while, and we also discussed the crypto stuff. And then we talked a little bit about acceleration. So OpenZFS has some patches to vectorize certain calculations, like the RAID-Z parity calculation and the checksums, like Fletcher 4 and so on. Some of these, somebody's actually created a PR where they have a modified patch to bring these into FreeBSD, and just need someone to start playing with that a bit and get that integrated up into FreeBSD. So it'd be great if anybody's interested in doing, AVX2 type stuff to make that happen. And then I provided a quick status update on SESutil, which is a tool that Baptiste Roussan and I added to FreeBSD for management of storage arrays, in particular blinking the little LEDs on, storage servers, controlling being able to just say, turn on the fault light for DA7 instead of having to use a specific tool from each different HBA controller card. It uses the SCSI Enclosure Services protocol, and it works with pretty much any backplane.
So that a rack monkey can exchange the right disk.
It doesn't currently work with devices that don't have a backplane, like direct attached storage, which I have on some of my servers because I was using SATA drives. And so it'd be really nice if we could have the some of the more popular HBAs, like the MPS and MPR, create virtual SES devices so that you could use SES to issue the commands, and then the storage controller would do its bit, and so on. And then we talked about MPS Util, which was created by Scott Long and Baptiste, and allows you to manage that specific type of HBA, but also be able to update the firmware from inside FreeBSD, which is really handy.
Yeah, that was almost the last day, but then we moved all to a lecture theater in Cambridge, which is like, almost like studying there. But yeah. So we had a couple of short talks on the last day, in the last hour or so. They were planned as really short talks to get people updated on certain issues. And we have links to them in the show notes because they're on the FreeBSD wiki. The slides are uploaded there from most people as far as I can see. And there was a couple of discussions, and then even the best Dev Summit has to come to an end. So we said goodbyes and thanks to all the Cambridge folks that did the organizing and the booking of the rooms and the organizing of our college stays and all these things. So thanks again for organizing this, the group around Robert Watson at the Cambridge Computer Lab. And we're looking forward to doing it next year with maybe even more people and more rooms and more discussions. We also did a little group photo. So if you go to the wiki page for the Dev Summit, you can see our faces and the whole group that was there to get an overview of how many people we were.
Yes, and Groff was there.
Yeah, of course.
Yep. Overall, a great Dev Summit. I've managed to get some of the work that was assigned to me actually finished at the Dev Summit in related hacker lounges. So shortly, I hope to commit changes to the bootloader. That currently in the bootloader menu, there's a little option there to switch between kernel and kernel.old. And in loader.conf, you can expand that list of kernels. But what this does is if you haven't done that, which most people haven't, it will automatically populate it with a list of the currently installed kernels. So it looks around in boot and finds all of the different kernels and lists them in that menu so that you can cycle through them. This will be important with package base, where when you install a newer kernel, it will keep like the 4 or 5 previous kernels so that you'll easily be able to fall back to an older one if the newer one has some problem. And it also, once I got that working, I extended it further and made it actually refresh that list when you switch boot environments. So if you use the other boot environment menu and switch to a different boot environment, it automatically refreshes the list of available kernels, so you don't try to pick a kernel that doesn't exist in a boot environment. And
yeah.
I hope to have that out for review and ready for commit very soon.
Excellent. Yeah, I look forward to that. So after our BSD Cam recap, we have another story for you about for when you need to run your BSD inside a Penguin. And this is on the wiki.qemu.org, which is your favorite hypervisor on the Linuxes, I guess, with KVM. But it tells us about that the wiki provides details on how to run each of the various BSDs under QEMU. QEMU, by the way, is also available under FreeBSD and in package source, I think. I'm very sure.
Yep.
And that way you can layer it on top.
Yes, if you want to do nested virtualization, you can use QEMU. So in particular, it says at the top of this documentation is not written by a BSD expert, corrections welcome. So the target audience of this is Linux developers who want to test their application or code or whatever under the various BSDs. So it's in the interest of us as the BSD community to make sure this documentation is right and works, so that when somebody from Linux land decides to actually bother to try and test it, that they can succeed in doing that. So the wiki is in need of a bit of love. There are some questions in it. So like you can see here, they recommend downloading the FreeBSD QCOW image and running it, but then it says to do, check if VirtIO works on FreeBSD. Well, the short answer is yes, it does. And so that will need a little bit of fixing and it can get higher performance that way. And then they show adding lines to rc.conf. Maybe they could also recommend using sysrc for that bit. And so on. Playing with that. And then they build QEMU from source here by installing a bunch of dependencies and then compiling it. Well, a note in there about using the ports tree to build QEMU-devel or whatever might actually be quite helpful.
Yep.
The other interesting thing is it doesn't cover architectures. So, extending this wiki by providing some documentation on how to, say, run FreeBSD ARM images on your Linux x86 desktop, or MIPS or ARM64 and all the different architectures and so on. So you can extend that a bit there. So if you have used QEMU and know how to do some of this stuff, it'd be really helpful if you could help out with this wiki and get this documentation whipped into shape a little bit. Add a bit more BSD expertise to this page. They have subpages here for FreeBSD, OpenBSD, NetBSD, etc. So needs love from everywhere.
Yep. So people of all BSD flavors could improve this wiki and reap the results by getting better support from or a couple of more developers, because in the process they might find, hey, this isn't such a bad system at all. I might want to try it out a little bit further, like on a native install, not just in a virtual environment. We never know.
Yep. This week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by DigitalOcean. So you can head over there and do like Benedict finally did and set up a droplet.
Yep, I did the migration, or it wasn't actually a migration, it was actually a very easy process. You just sign up and enter your coupon code, FreeBSD Now there, and you get a little credit to get started, and then select basically the type of droplet you want and what kind of applications you want to install, or whether you want to have a certain firewall setting, and literally within seconds you spin up your VM. The longest in the process was actually fishing out or finding out the confirmation email out of my spam folder, because it ended up there. But once I had it, it's actually super fast to start your own install or your instance with FreeBSD or any other operating system and get all flash storage, and it's really great and easy to use.
Speaking of tutorials and the QEMU stuff we were just looking at, they also have a great set of tutorials over on DigitalOcean. They show a bunch of things, how to use certbot to do Let's Encrypt, or how to build a machine learning classifier in Python.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's regular updates from the community that they have, and many of these can be used right away in the DigitalOcean cloud and on your little droplets, because I guess if you start one droplet, it's relatively easy to start multiple droplets, because once you know and get to use this kind of interface that they have, then you probably want to run multiple ones. I can see that happening with myself.
Yes. Also, how thou canst maketh a fine program in Fortran. How can you resist reading a tutorial named that?
Yeah, this is great stuff that they have. Yeah.
Yep, so head over there. They have the whole range of features, whether you're just dabbling with BSD or you're a developer trying to bootstrap your application, or you're trying to do serious work. DigitalOcean covers the whole span. They have team support, business stuff, 24/7 support, networking, private networking, v6, firewalls, storage, high CPU instances, high memory instances, everything you could possibly need. Definitely head over there, check them out. You can start as little as $5 a month, and if you remember to enter the coupon code FreeBSD Now, it'll add an extra $10 to your balance.
Yep, and that's your little cloud droplet to get started in testing stuff or run productive things, and it couldn't be easier.
So now we have an interesting one about memcmp.
No, is it memcopy or is it
No, this is memcmp, so it's comparing two pointers.
Right. Then, yeah, okay. Then our show notes are wrong, actually.
Yeah, so say one bug recently found using the TIS interpreter on a widely used open source library involves the comparison of strings with memcmp. The unexpected condition was that memcmp was, in one case, called with a pointer to a buffer that was shorter than the length passed as the third argument, right? So normally the arguments you pass to memcmp are the first pointer, the second pointer, and the number of bytes of them to compare. But if you do something like memcmp A versus BC with a length of 3, that's not going to do what you expect. Or rather, it might do what you expect, and it might end horribly.
Yeah, C is a little bit scary in that regard, according to memory management and
So the
making
unexpected
errors.
condition was that in some cases, called with a pointer to a buffer shorter than the length requested by the third argument would break one of the two symmetric preconditions of the function. The reason that that might have made this use of memcpy seem okay to the developer is that buffers being passed are always differed before the end of the buffer they reach, right? So as an optimization, memcmp doesn't compare every single byte in the string. It compares them until it finds a difference, then it stops. So it seems like, well, that's perfectly valid. I'm never actually going to read all 3 bytes from the first string, even though it's only 2 bytes long. So some implementations that are based on stopping as soon as the difference is found would not have caused an out-of-bounds read, even though technically the inputs were invalid. The first question raised was whether that pattern is problematic according to the letter of the C standard. If it was, the second question was whether the busy maintainer of an open source package that made the internet tick, in this case glibc, would be bothered with such a bug report. So I would like to be able to say that the memcmp ACLS or ACSL contract was the product of careful deliberation, but unfortunately this is not so much the case. As with many standard function, the contracts were written quickly in order to get most of the standard library covered and have not been tested by time very well. Anyway, upon proofreading the relevant clauses of the C11 standard, my feeling was that the formalization was, in this particular case, correct, and that it was undefined behavior to pass memcp arguments to a buffer that wasn't fully valid. Even if the implementation sort of needs to read the buffer's characters in order for the purpose of finding the first mismatch. So then they look at how it's actually done in glibc. And find that it's often done a word at a time, which is more than 1 byte. So it says there are 2 distinct optimizations for long buffers. One that applies when both buffers start at the same offset modulo the word size, which is MCMP common alignment, and one that applies when they don't, MCP not common alignment. So the function MCP common alignment is relatively well behaved. It reads from the 2 buffers aligned words by aligned word, and thus reads the entire word that contains diffing bytes. If the caller passed buffers that aren't valid after the diffing bytes, this amounts to an out-of-bound reads, but this sort of out-of-bound access will probably not be detected by your MMU because it's only going to be a partial word. Whereas the not common align case, however, tells a different story. When passed carefully misaligned buffers, they create T1 and T2 here, where T2 is purposely misaligned. Although these buffers differ on the 8th byte, if we look at the code here, you can see what they contain. They're the same up until the 8th byte. What can happen is the glibc implementation of memcpy reads 8 bytes past the end of T1. And if they had purposely made the 16th byte differ instead of the 8th, it would also possibly make glibc's implementation of memcmp read 16 bytes past the end of the buffer, which could cause the program to crash if it's detected properly by the MMU. In conclusion, yes, some implementations of memcmp will crash when invoked with buffers that aren't valid for the full length, even if they differ early on. Right? So the assumption that, if you're comparing A to B, you're going to stop there and not read more bytes. But for speed, when you're dealing with bigger buffers, you often read multiple bytes at a time to compare them all, right? You can take advantage of the processor being able to do more work in one step. And so the assumption that, the length you provide doesn't have to be fully valid is incorrect. It says the circumstances are rare, which is probably the reason this bug wasn't found previously. But outside of the programmer's control. The design described in this post should be reported as a bug if it's found anywhere else. So,
yep.
Anyway, I found it pretty interesting to read such a detailed analysis of a bug in such a basic feature of libc.
Yep. And the article also has a couple of code examples there. So people who want to really dig deep into this, then they should look at the article because it has a couple of C statements, or not just a couple, also a bigger one in the middle to see where this is applied in the actual implementation. So, time for our news roundup this week. Starting with an exciting topic for many people, I guess, because it's Docker on FreeBSD. So this is on daemon-notes.com, and it starts off with a little description here that there are two approaches to running Docker on FreeBSD. The first one was created back in 2015, and it was a native port of Docker engine to FreeBSD. It was an ambitious project, but nobody stepped forward to continuously port the never-ending flow of upstream code to FreeBSD. So the port still exists in sysutils docker-FreeBSD, but it wasn't updated since 2015, and it's Docker version 1, and currently it's version 17 as of 2017. So that is probably not going to get anywhere. The other approach is to use the official way of running Docker on platforms other than Linux. Well, somewhat official, as Docker still does not support FreeBSD as a host officially. This is Docker Machine tool, which will in turn use VirtualBox to run a virtual machine with Linux and Docker Engine. Docker utility on the host will communicate with the engine inside VirtualBox, where all the work will be done. And this article that we have here is describing what needs to be done to start using it. And you need to have a couple of things in place before you can start with that. Of course, you need VirtualBox in the first place, because otherwise you don't have a functioning hypervisor. And do not skip adding bootloader.conf and etcrc.conf lines mentioned on that page. And after you install the port, there will be some information as well. You won't need to use any interface or anything, because Docker Machine will do all the work. Just make sure that VirtualBox is present and ready to be used. So we have basically the package installation first. So we install Docker, Docker-Machine, and Docker-Compose from our trusted package sources. And then Docker, so all these instructions are run as root, of course, and Docker will store its stuff in your home directory in the hidden .docker directory. You might want to run the virtual machine image files to live in your home directory, in this case just to create a symbolic link, or you might want to create a ZFS dataset maybe. So that's a little bit more, you can tune this. And with those two commands you have everything set to create the actual machine. So there's a docker-machine create command here that specifies that VirtualBox is going to be the driver, how much memory and CPUs you're going to have, the disk size, so this is typical for any virtual machine, and also what kind of networking you want to have, in this case the VirtualBox host-only network, and the name of your Docker machine after that. And then they have a little example there to show what it's going to look like, and that's basically it. You can check whether it's running by running docker-machine ls, which will give you a nice tabular view of how the virtual machine is currently doing. So it has the name we provided earlier. The driver is VirtualBox, of course. The state is running, and they provide also a URL where you can access that Docker machine. And access means connecting to the machine by a utility called Docker by default, and it tries to talk to the Docker engine running on the same host, of course. However, with specific environment variables, you can instruct it to talk to other hosts. Docker-machine can expose those variables for you. So if you do the step provided there, you can see that you can query the environment, what kind of Docker environment you have, and that will give us all kinds of information that we are needed to run the actual connection on the other host. And then pretty much you run the Docker run, there's a hello world example there, and then you can access the machine like any other. So this seems pretty easy and straightforward.
Yeah, so this is the interesting bit that came out of the discussions at BSD Cam, is that compared to V1, Docker V17 and later have moved away from this large monolithic application to a number of separate components, where the components that will be different on FreeBSD can be implemented specifically for FreeBSD, and that means all the other code, like most of the interface the user uses, will not have to be ported. It'll just work in a cross-platform way. So they've, stopped filling the bits with Linux-isms and made it in such a way that by creating a couple of these infrastructure bits as native FreeBSD tools, you can have actual native Docker on FreeBSD instead of having to use VirtualBox to run a Linux VM on your FreeBSD machine to get a Docker thing going. It'll be able to run native FreeBSD apps in a native FreeBSD jail and give you basically the same experience where you do Docker run hello world and it creates a jail and runs the hello world application in that jail.
Yeah, so people can get started on this. So there's a little text at the bottom saying that everything Docker related should work now, but it is a new port, so there might be bugs. So for one, the author of that article wasn't able to ping anything but 127.17.x.x from a running Docker container. But although TCP does work, so apt-get in Debian containers worked out of the box. So that might be something people might want to struggle or figure out why it's not working.
Likely just firewall or something. If TCP works, then ICMP should.
Yeah, or it's something with the host-only networking. Things like that are always difficult to figure out, but it's not impossible. Okay, next up we have the POSIX shell and utilities on shellhaters.org, actually, which doesn't sound very nice, but there is actually a nice collection of typical shell utilities people are using in their daily life.
So this is basically the things POSIX says every OS should have. So they're tools you can generally depend on having. If you're ever wondering, this command line I always use, but it's Linux only, and I want my script to work on BSD.
Yeah. And people are supposed to have a certain functionality in their shell, because if they want to port their shell script to another operating system that's POSIX compliant, they can be sure that those compatibility or that these tools are there and have the right switches and command line functionality that they are used to on the other system.
Right. So each of these utilities is a link to the POSIX man page for it. So this will show you basically only the functionality that's guaranteed to be in every OS, basically. So it doesn't list, as you see, all the other switches that only exist on Bash's built-in of Echo.
Yeah, some of these are missed, but if it's not in the standard, then there's no guarantee that those will be implemented.
Right. Well, in particular, you don't want to use it in your script if it means your script's only going to work on one operating system now.
Yeah, don't artificially limit yourself just because it's easy in the first time you write those shell scripts. Then it might be there might come a day where other people might want to use your script somewhere else in other Unix systems that are POSIX compliant.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool connection, and people can use it as a reference or just browse through it if they find a command there that they haven't used before. There's a little description for every of those.
Indeed. Like, I've never heard of this one. Oh, you don't want to use that one. That would be one.
Just because it's there doesn't mean you have to use it, yeah.
I think that was remote command execution over UUCP. You definitely
Oh,
want
yes.
to do that.
Unix to Unix copy. Ooh. Yeah, we've come a long way.
Yep. Do you know what else has come a long way? Hardware.
Oh, yeah. The good hardware. And we need people to integrate this well, like IX Systems.
Yes. Head over to ixsystems.com/BSD Now and check out their ultimate guide to buying a new server for open source. They help you build exactly the machine you need. when you talk to them, don't tell them what hardware you want. Tell them what problem you're trying to solve, what you want to use this server for, and they'll help you pick out the right parts. Especially now that Intel's gone and changed all their model numbers around. I, for one, haven't figured out the new system yet. So rather than saying I want this specific processor, it's like I need, I want to do this. I probably need at least this many cores, but should I have more or less? What's the better solution? Is it better to get a 2-socket system with lower number of cores for a set amount of money, or to get a single socket thing with even more cores but all in one socket, and so on?
And what about memory and storage and all these things?
For the FreeBSD cluster, we're building a new port snap mirror, and the current concern is power consumption. So we're going to target a machine with a low power CPU and using SSDs instead of spinning disks and everything we can to make it use less power. It's not going to need especially a lot of performance. It just needs at least this much storage, at least this much memory, and to use as little power as possible.
Yeah, but IX Systems are the experts who can tell you all these specifics, how these components work together, or what kind of issues might come across. But they have something in store for you, and test these servers rigidly and make sure that they are working at top performance for you to solve your computing needs.
Because they integrate stuff with FreeBSD all the time, they'll already know what stuff is going to work with your for your machine and what's not. And once they build your machine, they test it for 3 days to make sure that all the components are good. And that makes a big difference. Spotting a failed hard drive, the chance of a hard drive failing is highest in the first 2 days of it being on. So running it for 3 days lets them eliminate those faulty drives and replace them with good ones before they ship you the server, so that when you get it, it just works. So head over to ixsystems.com/BSD Now, get in touch with them, tell them I sent you, and they'll treat you extra nice.
Yep. Other things you might want to run on your server is Postgres. And we have a nice little blog post by Dan Langell, famously organizing PGCon and BSDCan as well. And he has run the FreeBSD diary for years now, and he always tries to keep it as its own external memory for things he wants to remember, but are done so infrequently that he needs to look them up, so he might as well blog about this. And he has written a blog post about PostgreSQL and logging to a file, because there are a couple of steps needed to get that working. And he has these steps carried out on FreeBSD 11 with Postgres 9.6. And in 9.6, there were a couple of changes in the port. And that led to a couple of changes with directories and where log files are placed. So this log file is not in the usual place where people expect it. So the blog post is there to help getting it done. It has composed of 3 parts. The first one is telling Postgres to log via syslog in the first place, because by default it doesn't. And second, it creates, or it tells FreeBSD, which is the host, to local Postgres to /var/log postgres.log, which is Dan's preference. You can change this if you don't like this, but it's good to have a log file that's named after the program that's logging for, so might as well follow that. And the third part is telling Postgres to the things you want logged, so which specific stuff is you're interested in. So are you looking for SQL problems, or are you looking for any server problems that are on the debugging level? So this is what you can tell in this step. The changes in PostgresConf pretty much boil down to all the log underscore lines in there, to change them to the log destination being syslog, and adding those like the time stamp that they should have and other different logging options you want to have. You could also increase the logging statement from notice to debug, which would give you a lot more debug output. So I have this in the university. I want to see specifically not only the errors, but also the bad SQL the students are writing, because then I can look at these and say, many of the students didn't understand this specific part. And just telling from the log files of the SQL they're entering, I can tell, oh, this is something I should repeat in class because they still struggle with this when they try it out in the lab. But moving on, next are the changes to syslog.conf, which is one line telling the program to just pull the notice once in local 0 messages, adding local 0.none to the line, which will free the messages up for later use in the config file, because otherwise Postgres messages will be in var log messages, and we want to keep those separate from the system messages. And log file rotation is also something. I could tell a little story about this. I had a problem once where a professor told me, hey, can you help me with this storage node? It's problem. It's no one can access it anymore. Okay, so I log on via the console, and sure enough, the whole file system was full. How did they manage that? Well, the student set up Postgres without setting up log rotation. So I had a log file from an application with 30 gigabytes that had constantly logged error messages. And at one point, the disk was full and no one could access it anymore. So lessons learned, log file rotation is your friend. And so this is what this line does. It's basically telling Postgres at which intervals it should create a new log file or rotate the old ones into either oblivion or some compressed format that it's easier to access later on.
Right, yeah, you can see the G there makes it gzip. You might actually choose xz to get better compression, but that will use more CPU, and if your database is busy, maybe you don't want to do that. And then the number 7 in there is it will keep the last 7 log files when it rotates them. So you can adjust that if you want to keep more or less of those. Other pro tip, if you're using ZFS, you can use combinations of quotas and reservations to make sure that just because, a var log fills up, that it doesn't stop you writing, say, to the database, and so on. Or in particular, to keep other parts of the system from filling up while still leaving some space for var log so that you can still log in to fix it.
Yep. And also you don't want to have ZFS run over 80% full.
That's less true than it used to be. You can,
you can
go a bit higher now without much fear.
Oh, cool.
You don't want it to go to 100% full, though.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but still, it's something to do and take a good care of. And also, you might want to name your log files with a timestamp. It's nothing like having a folder full of log files that are named just log file 1, log file 2, log file 3, and trying to figure out when was the last time this log file was written, and the time period that you are looking for is not in the name itself. So things like that. So that's all what you can set up in the blog post, or you can find in the blog post to set up your Postgres logging properly on FreeBSD. And yeah, you should check out Dan's other blogs he wrote, or the blog posts, because they're regularly updated with things that he's doing, and there's a good chance that something might be of interest to you as well.
So next up, we have an update to mandoc, which is the new toolkit for building man pages. So they've released version 1.14.2 as a portable. You can get it at mandoc.bsd.lv. So the notes just say here that they've released the portable version. All downstream maintainers are encouraged to update their ports and packages from 1.14.1 to 1.14.2. Most interesting thing is that there's now a Markdown output mode, so you can output man pages in Markdown. That's awesome. Thank you. Anchors for deep linking in the HTML output mode has been improved. There's a superset of functionality of the former mdoc.lint utility is now included in mandoc itself. It now supports C-style warnings, so the new W-style message levels for several new messages, so you can decide whether or not you want to include warnings about certain style things. Automatic line breaks inside individual table cells, rewrite of the equation lexer and some equation rendering improvements, and support for many additional low-level ROF features. And some various small features and bug fixes. You can get more detail by heading to the news page over at the mandoc.bsd.lv site. They've tested this new release on OpenBSD Current and Stable, NetBSD Current, Illumos, Debian, Void Linux, using both glibc and Musel, Crux Linux and SunOS 5.11.2 and 5.9 apparently. They say, as before, Catman and the regression suite cannot be used on old versions of SunOS. Big thanks to everyone who helped provide patches, bug reports, feature requests, advice, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good to see regular updates to Mandoc and these utilities. And there are also that many other open source systems are adopting it now, not just the BSDs.
Yes, yeah. The reason why they test it on Lumos is they're using it over there too.
And it's time for our BSD Bits this week. We start off with a good-looking terminal emulator which mimics the old cathode display. So if you still miss those, or maybe you have one and want to look at it comparing the two, there's a little X11 category cool-retro, that terminal application that you can run, which will render you a very, very convincing shell that will have the old look and feel that people might want to miss.
Yep.
If you've seen the Alien movies, then some of these screens look terribly similar, and you could probably have a similar experience running it on yours.
I remember running on a machine like this. It was green instead of orange, but I remember the reactions of seeing. I think in TrueOS, one of the screensavers that was on my laptop by default was printing some stuff in a similar style to this. And it got quite a few looks at BSD Cam last year, actually.
It is definitely eye candy, and people are not used to it anymore as much as they had it in the past. Yeah, there's a couple of screenshots in the link that we have in the show notes.
Oh, there's the green one.
Oh, yeah, in the middle. Yes, that's the refresh rate and all that. And now we have our 4K displays and all these, and just going back to retro views. It's interesting to see the people looking at older stuff more to use and not use the newer stuff, like highly rendered and perfectly rendered fonts and all this kind of stuff. But if you are interested, then check out the GitHub page or install the port itself and get a little retro feeling going.
Speaking of TrueOS, they've just announced their milestone. The OpenRC conversion project is now done. Over 1,000 scripts or ports have been converted and will be available as part of the TrueOS unstable and stable tracks very soon. The project wants to extend a huge thanks to all those who contributed in completing the milestone, with special thank yous to contributors Zachary Welch and elarge011 for doing the lion's share of the work. And then they have a couple other people they thanked in here, including Chris Moore 134, and I'm guessing Ken is Beanpole 135.
I guess, yeah, that's their users in their forums.
Yep, Norwegian Rock Cat, Package Demon, Rebos, a bunch of other people.
There's also an upcoming FreeBSD Journal article about their experiences converting to OpenRC. And I know about this because I did the interview there. So that's something people might want to look at if the issue comes out. Mm-hmm. Okay, next up.
As another example of cross-project developer collusion, John Baldwin posted over on the Lumos developers discussion list saying, I'm a FreeBSD developer primarily, though I also work on non-kernel things from time to time. And he says one of his recent projects was to port MDB, which is the Lumos debugger, to FreeBSD to support debugging FreeBSD kernels like crash dumps and live kernels. The port is rather limited in what it does not support examining user processes yet, and it does not support KMDB. However, it's functional and includes FreeBSD-specific kernel modules that include some walkers and support for FineStack and kgrep. And he talks a bit about it and has some questions and some thoughts about how to do stuff and how interested Lumos would be in this stuff coming back upstream. Thomas Soom, who's an Lumos developer but also a FreeBSD developer now, says this is very welcome work and he's certainly excited about the outcome of that. And Matt Ahrens, who's one of the merge advocates, one of the few people with commit access to Illumos, says, John, this is great work, and I'm glad that you found MDB to be useful, as Matt has. Personally, I'd love to see the ZFS dmod working on FreeBSD, as well as a few other D commands that are particularly useful, like walklist, nvlist, and walkabl. I'm not that familiar with the tail call unwinding that you mentioned earlier, but if it happens in Illumos 2, it'd be great to get that functionality upstreamed into Illumos. I think the rate of change in core MDB isn't very high, but I would still be nice, in theory, to get most of your MDB changes back into Illumos, if only to make it easier for you to pull down more MDB changes in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that continues to happen.
Yep, having not only GDB and other compilers, but also MDB, which has a couple of compelling features only MDB has, would be good to have in our little debugger tool chain. And of course, the more debuggers you have, the more likely it is that it finds the error you're looking for. Okay, next up in our BSD section is there's a large batch of kernel errata patches released, and this is a posting on undeadly.org. And it basically is a response to the DEFCON presentation by Ilya van Sprandl. A large set of kernel patches have been released for OpenBSD 6.0 and 6.1. And these important patches should be applied as soon as possible. So if you are listening to this, stop the recording or the video and take care of those patches. They talk a little bit about what these patches are, but they also have... So they all have been fixed, as far as I can see.
Yep. So they say there's a SIGIO-related use after free that can happen in a couple of drivers. Missing length checks for send syslog that could cause a kernel panic. Out-of-bound reads in VFS get current work directory scander, mainly used for fuse, may result in a kernel panic or an information leak. Alignment issues with the receive call. Invalid address family with TCP user rec may cause an unintended code path. Missing socket address validation from userland may result in an info leak. Uninitialized variables in ptrace and fcntl may cause info leaks. An integer overflow in ws display config ioctl may result in an out-of-band read. Race condition in sosplice may cause a kernel memory leak. Out-of-bound read could occur during processing of EA-PAL frames in the wireless stack. Information from the kernel memory could be leaked to root in userland via the IEEE 802.11 ioctl, and then they note that there are binary updates for all of these available via their new syspatch tool as well.
Okay. And as these affect the kernel, a reboot is needed after patching, so people need to reboot because otherwise there's no way to get these patches applied or into the system. Okay. Next up, for the OpenSense people, the 17.1 release is out. So in the release, there's a couple of new things there in the announcement, and they have a diff against basically the 17.7 RC2. So a couple of interfaces changes in DHCP 6C. They can now properly reload without leaking its listening socket to like OpenVPN. Also in the interfaces section, they correctly write host unique string to PPOE configuration contributed by Paolo Velati. To firmware things like fixing JavaScript typo in the GUI that would prevent an update with pending reboot, and zap spurious new lines in end of live messages. So there's a couple of more changes there. There are also language translation for Chinese, Czech, German, Japanese, Russian, and German has been 100% completed already. Oh, this is nice. And the other ones are also on the verge of being 100% complete.
Yep, they also list two currently known issues with the 17.7 release. Users upgrading from 17.7 RC2 may have trouble upgrading via the graphical interface, but they provide a command to run manually to work around that. And there was a regression in the floating rules that might make it not honor the non-quick setting. That's too many nots in one sentence there. But they also have a patch for that that'll come out as the next point release as well.
Okay. Nice one. Yeah. Oh, the next one is short but sweet. We have the Twitter co-founder and CEO stating FreeBSD rules them all. So there's the link in our show notes to that Twitter post.
Yeah. So it's a Hacker News discussion arguing, GNU versus Linux versus Herd and what's the other one? The mock kernel and so on. And he says like revisiting a childhood vacation spot and seeing that nothing has changed. And then, yes, Jack tweeted that it's all wrong. FreeBSD is what you want to use.
Yeah, and there were a couple of responses to that, but this certainly was unexpected from the founder of Twitter or the CEO.
So, just a gentle reminder that very soon conferences are coming up. FreeBSDCon is September 7th through 9th, with this episode coming out a little bit later because we pre-recorded it because, well, we're getting ahead of time so that we have an episode the week we're at FreeBSDCon. It means you really need to hurry up and register. If you're coming to the conference, and we really hope that you are, make sure you book that in time for the conference.
Yeah, definitely. Get out there and see what cool talks they have. And they already have the schedule out there, more like the speakers and their bios and what they're going to talk about. So I'm among them, and we're going to have a nice conference, I guess. But the more people that are out there, the more worthwhile it's going to be.
But yes, there will be a talk about BSD community dynamics, and it's kind of related to FreeNAS and some other stuff. It'll be interesting. Building or isolated build BSD environments using virtual and real hardware, a deep dive into FreeBSD's kernel random number generator, the one we talked about earlier, Oblivious sandboxing, developing a transparent sandbox with Capsicum. So that's running an application in a sandbox without modifying its code. The state of network security tools on BSD, making GetS and its friends more like SIGPipe and SIGIL. BSD system management with Ansible. I wonder who's giving that one. The history and future of core dumps on FreeBSD, modern multi-core synchronization and concurrency kit, and then the realities of dtrace on FreeBSD, and lastly, using package stores for multi-platform deployment in heterogeneous environments. So that's was one I was inspired to make sure got into the conference because of that talk we had, article we featured about a month ago about using package stores to build the same packages for, Linux and BSD at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that would be good to watch.
And then
watch and see.
EuroBSDCon is coming up very soon as well. That'll be September 21 through 24, and you should go and register for that as soon as possible. The early bird pricing ends August 15th, and this episode comes out on August 16th, so
a day late, yeah.
But don't worry, it's not that much more expensive. But hurry up and register. We want to see you at the conference.
Yeah, it's Paris, France. What other reason do you have to not get there? I mean, this is awesome by itself. And the people there and the conference, the best way to get into the free or the BSD Hive. The whole community will be there, I guess.
So we look forward to seeing you there.
Yep. Another person who is going to Paris, France is the author of our Tarsnap, which is the feedback and question sponsor this week. Tarsnap.conf. Colin Percival will be at EuroBSDCon, so you can thank you what kind of great solution he has built with Tarsnap as the online backups for the truly paranoid.
Yep. And exciting news this week, Tarsnap GUI has released version 1.0. So now if you're running on your laptop or whatever, you can use a graphical interface. So you can create your backups and archives and jobs and set it all up so it happens all automatically. You see here's your backups that you're running and how many items are in them and how big they are. Then you can look at the archives that exist in the cloud, and then you can manage the jobs that go and back them up. And all the settings. Makes it super easy to do just by clicking around in a GUI.
Yeah, excellent. Because people want to sometimes have a GUI and see all their files and things, but it's also working just as well, tarsnap on the command line for all different kinds of operating systems, the BSDs, the Linuxes, the Mac OSs of this world, and also Windows, which probably also have the GUI in time. Yeah, check out tarsnap and back up your files securely into the cloud.
Yes,
you're the only person
that,
with the keys.
Like the big red warning in the GUI here. If you lose the key file, you will not be able to access the backups. While that sounds like a bad thing, it's a good thing. Importantly, it means someone without the key file can't access your backups. And that's what you want if you want secure backups.
Yep. Okay, let's go into our feedback and questions section for this week, starting off with Dominic about monitoring software. So he writes, "Hi guys, in the last episode you had a mail from Joseph regarding monitoring. Here are my experiences over the years. After a long period of time using Nagios 1.x, I used Zabbix in a different company. The system is still in use as far as I know, and it is quite okay for a smaller number of hosts. The Nagios system in my company was replaced by CheckMK, and this solution is still in use. We are monitoring around 500 hosts in different locations using multiple monitoring servers. CheckMK is mostly a configuration extension for Nagios itself. It allows you to automate the service detection using a GUI, which is called WATO, W-A-T-O, and has a nice enhancements as well. Beside that, they provide an easy way to set up distributed monitoring, and they integrate the most common Nagios plugins like Nagvis, etc. in their Enterprise Edition. They optionally replace the Nagios core with their enhanced monitoring core. This helps a lot if you need to pull a lot of SNMP devices, but I haven't used it that myself yet." There's also a link for a nice picture of the architecture that they are using, and for him, it combines the best of two worlds, the compatibility of Nagios and the WATO configuration interface for GUI lovers. As we are managing the monitoring within a team, every member can manage the monitoring based on his or her skill level. The system is very stable. The update process is well designed, and you can see that people with experiences have designed it. They have integrated a command line tool that helps you to configure and manage what they call a monitoring site. You can run, set up, export, backup, and update monitoring sites using that command, and it manages the complete setup for that installation. It makes it easy to run even multiple monitoring installations on the same box, and for example, give different departments their own monitoring instance. Mm-hmm. Maybe someone is looking for such features, and this helps him to find a good monitoring solution for his needs, and the raw edition is free and open source. But there's one downside. We don't have a port in FreeBSD yet. Kind regards, Dominic.
Yes.
Okay.
Hopefully somebody would like to use this tool and will create one.
Yep. We could try putting this on the wanted ports wiki page, and then might find it in the hands of a porter who has some time and is also interested in getting more monitoring solutions in FreeBSD. And then in the future we might have just package install this specific CheckMK. Okay, good suggestion. We'll see what porters are making out of it, and if not, then we just have to install it manually or find other ways to get it running. But I'm sure they will port it.
So the next email is from Darren about the wonderfulness of awk. He says he once did a presentation for his local Linux user group in Leeds in the UK, so that what could be done with awk. So he started with a code fragment, while not end of file from standard in, get the buffer. If do your test on the buffer, and if it does, if true, then do funky process. Otherwise, throw wobbler. I asked my audience if they could had too much of that code fragment in C, and proceeded to show that I've been doing with awk in the previous few weeks. I had the usual log summarizers, but using awk functions to break down a complex test into several simpler ones. I also had a go at intelligent process control, read killing a non-working music player that was annoying me at the time.
It's good to know about what other cool stuff R can do. All right, that was Darren, and next up is Andrew with thanks. He writes, I'm encouraged by your works and the show. Thanks to all the OpenBSD guys and FreeBSD people, I can now SSH to my very own SunSpark Enterprise T5220. I got it used off of eBay. Anyway, I don't know it all, but I managed to put Solaris 10 1.13 on it this weekend. He says he tunes in to learn things that he doesn't know and see what else people are doing with their BSDs. Thanks again. This is interesting. This might be worth a blog post. Good stuff. Yeah, and great to see that the show is exciting for people and they try out the BSDs on various platforms that they have and make good use of it. And last but not least is Jens with a migration question. He writes, greetings from Germany. Hi. I am new to your show and I really enjoyed a few episodes I listened to by now, especially the ones where you talk about ZFS and laptop integration. I use ZFS on my Linux Ubuntu machine by now, and that brings me to my set of questions. I would like to migrate my Ubuntu 16.04 to some flavor of BSD. Great. I have experience with OpenBSD as a firewall and just set up a smaller server as an office internal MX relay using a smart host. The Ubuntu server runs the ZFS tools and then the tools version. The OS runs on an MD mirror and the Z-pool is a 4-disk striped mirror. His ZFS are in version 5 according to ZFS get version. In addition to the file server role using NFS and Samba, his server acts as a mail relay and archive running postfix and Dobicut. As far as I got into OpenBSD, this should be an easy, transparent migration. The same should basically apply to his OpenVPN server. And first question, can I migrate the existing ZFS by installing a flavor of BSD on the OS disk and just continue using the Z-pool?
So yes, if you just overwrite your MD RAID with FreeBSD, you'll be able to just Z-pool import the ZFS pool. Sadly, OpenBSD does not support ZFS, and NetBSD's support for ZFS is not up to date. It's not actively maintained. So you'll want to use FreeBSD in order to just import your ZFS pool. What's interesting is because you have 4 disks as an OS mirror, if you use FreeBSD, you could add those 4 disks to the pool as another 2 sets of mirrors, and then install the OS onto the existing pool even. But that's a bit more complicated to do. So yes, you can just install the OS to those your OS disks, and then Z-pool import and load up your ZFS pool, and it will just work. That's the awesomeness that is ZFS, is that it's perfectly happy for you to import it on Linux and FreeBSD and the Lumos all.
And it also isn't too picky about, endianness, little or big endian.
Yes, it's the only file system I know of that where you can easily just import a Spark pool into an x86 machine and vice versa. With UFS, that doesn't work.
Unfortunately not, So second question, I'm using bridged OpenVPN with Linux and the tab devices they have there. I'm having a hard time to find information on how to do that in BSD.
We have a bunch of tutorials in the archives on the BSD Now show notes. But in general, FreeBSD has tap interfaces and it'll work very much the same way as it does on Linux.
Yeah, so same name, you pretty much can feel right at home. I watched a couple of the other episodes we did. They should be in there. The rest of the server won't be an issue at all, as I figured out by now. Okay, great. Now to his second project, laptop and desktop. Which BSD flavor should I pick to start with that as good support for desktop and laptop hardware? He's thinking about using an old NC10 netbook and Lenovo SL500, and as a special treat for himself, a mini ITX-based all-in-one PC with an EET eGalax touchscreen.
Okay, so for a netbook or something like that, that's probably 32-bit only. OpenBSD might be a good choice. The Lenovo, I can't tell from the model number what it is, but for a modern, like AMD 64 type machine, TrueOS is a very nice. It's basically a spin of FreeBSD with a graphical installer and a desktop-y, laptop-y experience by default. Probably be an easier transition for you coming from Ubuntu. It's the closest thing BSD has to a Ubuntu.
Yep. And at the Cambridge Dev Summit, I saw George Neville-Neal's and Colin Percival's System 76 notebook that were running FreeBSD.
Galago Pro.
Mm-hmm. Those were some nice machines with 32 gigs of memory and various options for swapping out the CD drive or the DVD drive with a different disk. So this is pre-installed. It came with Ubuntu, I think. But they swapped it with FreeBSD, of course, and they had
I was in the lounge when Colin got his graphics working through Suspend and Resume.
Oh, amazing! Yeah, so Jens closes with, I hope you can point me in some direction on my questions. I'm not at all afraid to try multiple and work my way through some of the internals. I'm about to set up a Ubuntu test server with ZFS to try installing a new OS without touching the ZFS at all. Yeah.
But yeah,
that's pretty much our
ZFS,
suggestion.
Your only real option is FreeBSD, but it's the best option anyway.
Yeah. Or if you just want to run it as a file server for a while and then get into laptops separately, it's working. I mean, you can also just use Ubuntu ZFS and then import pools or send the snapshots back and forth. So there you can do a gradual migration. You don't have to do a whole big bang migration, but you can have gradually work your way and get more experiences with the BSDs, and then you won't miss most of the functionality that you're having on Linux anyway. And since you're already using ZFS, you're on a good path to make that migration less bumpy.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week as well.
Another week of BSD Now.
Yes, so if you have questions like the ones we just answered, make sure you email us at feedback@bsdnow.tv. Also, if you have any show topic ideas, things that you feel we should have covered and didn't, or whatever, stories you want us to know about, make sure you email them in to us.
Yeah, blog posts you've written or you found, or tweets that you find interesting. Could be anything with BSD content to fill a future BSD Now episode to share for everyone.
We make the show for you, but we also need your help to make the show.